Well, hello. And delighted that so many people have showed up for this talk today. Uh, this is a very unusual person. I know more about him as a kid from his mother. When I retired from teaching, I would go with my husband to the burgers over at the split of 70 and 100, and I would sit with his mother and her two friends who made judgments on the condition of the world and people and so forth. And I listened to it, and I learned a lot. I really did. I learned a lot about our speaker today, Randy. But it's probably not what he really wants you to know. So I'm just going to jump in and let Randy come up here and let him let you know some of the wonderful things that he does as a professional. Come up and give our people your knowledge.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you. I'm so glad to be here today, and thank you for coming and listening. I don't purport to be the expert on Vultee, even though my name is on here and it says Vultee. So some of you may know more than I do, but this is just a perspective from one family who is involved in Vultee. And so you may have other perspectives or more information or can correct some of my information as we go forward, but it is a start. So just a little bit about who I am. Not that it's important because the focus is not on me for this, but on my parents, who are Charles Gross and Doris Moskowitz Gross, whom you knew very well. They both worked for Vultee Aircraft during World War II. And my dad and his business partner eventually started a company called Tennessee Matt Company after World War II. And that company was right over here in Wedgwood, Houston for many years. It's now in Smyrna. I'm an economic and strategic planning consultant, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But some local projects that I've worked on that you might have an interest in are the Fort Negley Museum, which I worked with Tracy a little bit on. The feasibility study for a new museum here for Metro Parks and Rec. And so they're going to be programming that into the master plan of the new dispensation for Fort Negley. And then I also worked on Music Row on a strategic plan for that. Some of you may know Carolyn Brackett, who has worked for the National Trust for Historic Preservation. I've worked with her. And some other things that I've been working on more recently that are of historic interest in the Nashville area. But I work globally. I had an office in South Africa and London, different places over the years. So a little bit about some background on my family and where they came from. Our family is Jewish. They came from Poland and Russia. They started coming here around 1910. So we've been in Nashville, 115 years or so. Our family attended the Gay Street Synagogue downtown, which is now West End Synagogue on West End Avenue. My parents are up at the top here. The man in the middle, I guess I have a pointer I could use. This man right here is my dad, and that's my mother right there in the 1930s before the war. This is my dad and his family. And again, his parents were from Poland. And this is some of my mother's family here. My parents both attended Hume-Fogg High School. That's my dad. He was on the track and field team. I don't know if you knew that or not. At Hume-Fogg, he was a sportsman. We have pictures of him doing every single type of sports, which is hilarious to look at because it's literally bowling, baseball, everything. But he was really into sports. My parents got married in 1942, but they had a sweet little courtship over a couple of years. This was at Dunbar Cave in Clarksville. They used to go there a lot. And my mother's nickname was Dooley. Her real name was Doris. But when she was a child, there was, an Irish immigrant who had an ice delivery company called Dooley's Ice. This was back in the 1920s. And my mother used to chase after the truck or something in the summer to get the ice. But anyway, her brothers used to make fun of her and called her Miss Dooley. So that's how she got the nickname Dooley. So that's the only way people knew her was as Dooley.
Oh, I knew her.
That's right. So Vultee came along in the 1930s. There was a consolidation in the aircraft industry with the Aviation Corporation of California, which later became Avco, absorbing rivals including Stinson and Vultee. They became divisions of Avco. In 1939, and this is just from research I did for this speech today, but correct me if any of this is incorrect, there was a secret, apparently, Nashville Chamber of Commerce meeting, and their thought was they would induce Avco to build a Stinson-Vultee plant here because they wanted to move the airport the airport had moved from Murfreesboro to Nashville, and they wanted to create industry around the airport, and so Mayor Cummings at the time and the chamber really wanted to promote that. So they were able to attract Avco here and build a $9 million plant. And it was mainly to build the military observation planes at the time. Then sometime around 1939, Avco sort of spun out a little bit and became more autonomous. They were headquartered in Los Angeles. And of course, during the early 1940s, before Pearl Harbor, we were supplying planes to Britain, France, in support of their efforts through the Lend-Lease program. And France had ordered 300 Vultee V-72 aircraft from the United States, but then France was invaded by the Nazis, and so then Britain later ordered those same aircraft plus another 300 and for their defense. So 600 were going to be produced by Vultee. Around that time, the construction started, and I'll talk about that in a second, of the Vultee plant here. But in May of 1941, Wendell Willkie came to the opening of Vultee's Nashville division. And it was the first aircraft factory built in the defense zone, as it was known, between the Rockies and the Alleghenies, because most of the aircraft in America was made on the West Coast in California. You had Grumman, you had Lockheed, all of those big companies were in California. Vultee, at that time, was an extremely progressive company. They were the pioneers in the use of women assemblers that we all know today as Rosie the Riveter, women who worked on building airplanes. And Vultee produced the first V-72, which was known as the Vultee Vengeance dive bombers from this plant here in Nashville. And then in July of 1941, they took the first test flight and they christened the V-72 in Britain because they were being sent as part of Lend-Lease to Britain. And Lord Halifax in Britain witnessed the christening of these new planes built in Nashville. So Vultee was constructed, as I said, 1940 and opened in 1941. These were the offices that were built. And then on the left, this is the site under construction. And Bob, where are you, Bob? Bob just recently provided a lot of information on the site. It's going under redevelopment yet again, and he has some information he can share after we're done here as well. The grand opening was May 4th, 1941, and as I said, Wendell Willkie attended the grand opening. And that's the actual copy of the invitation to the opening by Governor Prentice Cooper. And that sort of explains what that was all about. Some images there that's Wendell Willkie getting off his airplane coming into Nashville. My parents were fresh out of high school, and they joined up at Vultee Aircraft. Again, this was still peacetime in America. This was not a war yet, but they had orders to supply the British through Lend-Lease. My dad, at Vultee, they saw his potential, I guess, because he was a high school graduate, he was educated, they wanted to progress him at Vultee, and so the company put him through Vanderbilt for an industrial engineering degree, a night school degree. They also sent him to the Nashville Aircraft School. Are you familiar with the Nashville Aircraft School? It was part of what we now, or eventually knew as the Nashville Auto Diesel College, which is now Lincoln, I think, Lincoln College in Madison. But it was known for many years as the Nashville Auto Diesel College, and they had an aircraft division of it because of the aircraft being manufactured in Nashville. And so he had certifications in welding, aircraft assembly, sheet metal. I have each of these different certificates. Ergonomics, timing. He was big into timing, you know, because of an assembly line, you have to understand the timing of how all of that comes together. So that's when they both joined. My mother joined up, and she was also on the assembly line, which I didn't know until recently because she never really talked about it. But I heard from the rest of my family that she actually worked in the assembly process, not riveting, but like on a assembly belt or something, putting pieces on the belt. So that was her job when she first started. And they had fallen in love by this stage, and so they would send messages, love messages to each other through the pneumatic tube system while they worked there. I don't know if the Army knew about that or the Department of War or whatever knew about that, but they were clearly in love at the time, and that was one way and it was a big factory, so that was one way they sent messages to each other. So we all know what happened on December the 7th, 1941, a day that will live in infamy at Pearl Harbor. And immediately after this, the United States government seized the 300 V-72 frames. In other words, remember we had Lend-Lease. We were going to sell these 600 planes eventually to Britain. The U.S. needed them. They felt like they needed them, so they seized that contract. They canceled the contract and took those 300 frames that had been built for the V-72s. So at the declaration of war, you know, everyone was signing up, as you probably know. These are all family members of mine, uncles and cousins. This is my Uncle Morris right here in the Navy. My Uncle Milton was that'd be the Army. You know, and different ones here, different family members. That's Uncle Harry. And then this is my dad here, and those are some of his best friends that he was growing up with. And this is in front of the old YMHA that was downtown, right near where the state office building is now. His best friend, Ralph Shepard, is the one on the end here, and he fought in the war and died, I think, in the last month or two of the war in the Pacific, and had sent a V-mail message to my dad saying, hey, I miss all of you guys. I'll be seeing you soon. The war's ending. And then he was killed right after that. So very sad. But they all served, and all the men were going off to serve, and the women, you know, were doing their part as well. My dad was drafted and went to induction at Camp Forrest, which you may be familiar with, existed in Tullahoma. It's now the Arnold Air Force Engineering Unit. Is it Arnold Air Force Base, I guess, in Tullahoma? But it was a place where a lot of the people from Nashville would go to be inducted into the military at that time. And he went through the medical exam, like this young chap is doing. And they said, my dad said that they would line up all the guys in a big circle, and then the doctor would, you know, a white coat would come by and inspect each. They were all stripped to their underpants, and the doctor would look at each guy and sort of look them up and down and see what was going on there. And then there was a little scribe following them, like writing down, taking all the notes, you know, furiously. Something happened because my dad got a letter, you know, stating you were rejected from the military for medical reasons. And he went back to the Camp Forrest because he wanted to serve. He really wanted to serve, like all of his friends and families. So he went back and he said, what happened? And the director at the camp, whatever, looked through the files, and he pulled up my dad's file, and it says, let me see here. It says, missing thumb. And my dad said, which one? And clearly the scribe had gotten off like by one person on every whatever. So that's what happened. But that wasn't the reason he didn't serve in the military. He actually was deemed an essential service. And so because he was working at Vultee, he had this education, and so he moved on there. And at Vultee, he was promoted very rapidly, and he became head of plant layout, which is sort of like chief engineer, whatever, for the manufacturing process. So he was, all of that on that board, that's him there pointing to the process, or part of the process of manufacturing the aircraft that's at Vultee in his studio there. And I guess he started at Department 51, Methods and Control, and he was promoted to layout manager, and he was responsible for plant layout and engineering, industrial assembly, timing and efficiency again, and ergonomics, which means, making the manufacturing work in a way that caused the least stress to the worker's physical capacity. So, among the things that he did there, in addition to his job, where he came up with some innovations. For example, he worked with RCA engineers to develop the plant's sound system. And the quote in the newspaper was, "It's the finest one ever to be built in an American manufacturing plant." Whether that was true or not, who knows? But they bragged about it. And it was built to expedite communications. It was really a way, instead of having like a loudspeaker here and an alarm here or whatever, he integrated all of those systems together. He also designed and redesigned some of the machinery that was used as part of the manufacturing process. And he also, as part of the ergonomics, he would see the women, mainly women, building the planes, and they would have back problems, they'd be out sick with leg problems because you were standing on hard concrete floors all day long. So he decided to recycle, which was the only thing you could do, there wasn't much material, tires and wood, and make mats and things for the women to stand on while they're doing their hard work. So, so that was mainly the ergonomics of what he was doing there, was helping the workers feel better and safer. So my dad, to learn about the process of how to set up an aircraft plant, it's not just a natural thing that you get from Vanderbilt, industrial engineering degree. He was sent to other plants to see how they were set up. And he told me stories about being sent to Los Angeles to work for Lockheed, or to look at the Lockheed plant and learn from that. And he said, he was flying into Los Angeles when he was first going there, and you see these there were still farms in Los Angeles and little towns with church steeples, and it was very quaint, and there were trees. It wasn't until later that he realized that was all camouflage, that those little farms and everything are built on top of on top of Lockheed and airplane factories. All of this is farmland and churches and buildings built on top of the factories. And the reason is they were so afraid of a Japanese invasion after Pearl Harbor on the West Coast, on the mainland United States, that they had to camouflage everything. And that's why factories started moving inland to places like Nashville, or production especially. So in this particular case, Lockheed had massive facilities, but thank goodness for Hollywood to be able to come up with all these sets, basically, to build on. They had all the people there necessary to build the sets to make it look like a country town or a farm, on top of those buildings. His other story from that time was
Bogart part of that?
Pardon?
Bogart was part of that.
Yeah, so the other story from that time was that it just so happened that Lockheed shared a lunchroom or something with Disney Studios. And so he would eat lunch there, and he'd see all kinds of celebrities. And he had heard, there was scuttlebutt about all the celebrities, just like today. And he had heard that Bogart was a drinker, womanizer, a drinker. He was always a lush, basically, was the story. And my dad was sitting at the counter in one of these, lunchrooms, and in walks Humphrey Bogart and sits right next to him. And Dad's looking at Humphrey Bogart and thinking, they're right. He was like wobbly and, he had dark circles under his eyes. And my dad thought the stories must be true. But then the waitress came over and she said, "Bogey, you look terrible. What's wrong with you?" She's chewing her gum. And he said, "Oh, I can't do a Bogey imitation, sorry, but I got all these shots and inoculations because I have to film a film in Africa. So they gave me all these shots." And as much as I wanted that to be the African Queen that he was going to shoot, that was after the war. So apparently it was war bond. He was shooting war bond movies or films in Africa for whatever reason. So that's where I think he must have been going. But that's one of the stories there. He also spent time in Allentown, Pennsylvania, in New Orleans, both sharing information and learning from these other facilities, military facilities, as part of that. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about production at Vultee. So the picture on the left, the newspaper clipping, is of some of the 7,000 workers that worked at Vultee during the war. This is the Vultee Vengeance in production on the right. And just in terms of the timeline, and how are we doing on time? Okay. In March 1942, that V-72 I talked about, which later became the A-31, was sold to the UK, and then the US started making the A-35, but there was another plane called the Dauntless that it was competing against. So Vultee had to compete, in terms of those contracts. In 1943, in July, the A-31 was quoted as being incredibly effective against the Australian and British action in Burma. But even so, the higher-ups in Britain didn't believe the pilots when the pilots said it was performing really well, so they pulled the contract. Then in 1943, Vultee and Consolidated Aircraft merged to form Convair. That was another. There were multiple companies, that merged in the aircraft industry. And in 1944, they got a contract to produce the P-38, which is, of course, a very famous plane, the Lockheed Lightning, and they produced 113 units, planes of that plane at Vultee. And then in September of 1945, the last P-38 was delivered and the order was canceled. That was kind of the end of wartime production. So here are some of the planes. That's the Vultee Vengeance. That's what it looked like. And I had a friend, when I had the office in Africa, I did some work for the Bank of Southern Africa, and there was a man that worked there, an older man that worked there, who remembered being a child during World War II and loved the Vultee Vengeance. When it would fly over, when he heard the American planes flying overhead, he knew all the American planes, and he loved hearing those American planes protecting Britain when he was a child, hiding, during the war. That's the upgraded Vengeance, the one that had to compete. And then there's the P-38 Lightning, and that picture on the left shows it under production at Vultee. And then this is my dad's team in terms of the layout team and their shop. These were all pictures that he had from the War Department, I guess it would have been, and we had possession of these images, which I've donated to the state archives in case you ever want to see the originals. But that's the layout team on the left. And then on the right, you can see him. Now, layout was all done with individual little wooden handmade pieces. There's the shop. You could get a good feel for it on the right, sort of like an architect's studio or an engineer's studio, basically. And that's my dad on the left. And those are with the foremen, so the guys are actually on the ground, during the production process. So my dad met with them, I'm sure, quite a bit and showed them how things were supposed to lay out and work. And there was an article in the Tennessean with my dad in it there on the left. And it was just showing, again, that those little pieces that they used to do the layout, there were thousands of them. They were all handmade. Of course, the article said not doll furniture, which is true. But of course, today you'd have the advantage of using computers, computer-aided design to do all of that. You wouldn't have little wooden pieces that you'd have to have handmade and lay out, thousands of those. So it's a very different situation today. Now, the woman standing in the background on the left, remember her for a moment, but we'll come back to her in a few minutes, okay? So the military brass visited Nashville, visited Vultee several times during the war. This was one of the times, and that's, you don't have to read all of that, but there's a list of the various generals and lieutenant generals and Navy, various ones who visited in 1943. And then this one in 1944, my dad was on the front page of the Tennessean over here, and this is the actual picture. And he's showing the generals the layout of the plant and everything that was happening there. And it was General Knudsen was sort of the head of production or something for the military. But the man that my dad always talked about the most was this guy right here. Not the generals, but this man right here. And I did some research. I never knew his name, but apparently his name was Walter Ford. He wore overalls, and he was disabled. And he handcrafted all of those models. He handcrafted, he was a woodworker and a carpenter, and he handcrafted all of those little planes to perfect specifications because they had to be measured and timed, for the production process. And all of the various elements, and my dad always admired him for that work because it was always a precision craft. I mean, you can't really, there's very few people who can do that now. It's all done by machines. So he always admired him. This is a little bit about the General Knudsen. One of the things that's interesting is that when he was in Nashville, he said, "The South has demonstrated its industrial power, and there's no limit to what the South can do." It was almost like, is this 1876 or what? But it was an interesting quote from him. But he was originally born in Denmark, and yet he was the head of U.S. military production. Then there's my mom. That's her in the middle here, sitting on her knees, I guess. And some of the other women that she worked with at Vultee. And that's at the end of the war, near the end of the war, 1945, and I only know that because my dad wrote the date on it. But these are just different snapshots that they had from Vultee. All of this is, these two are at the factory. These were at someone's house, but they're the women who she worked with from Vultee. They had parties, they had different social events, that sort of thing. And then, as I said, Vultee really introduced the idea of women working on these planes and building them, and they were needed during the war especially because the men were off fighting in the war. And so Rosie the Riveter, these are actual Nashville Rosie the Riveters. So they were, when you think of Rosie the Riveter, don't think of California or someplace. They were right here in Nashville. And these were, down at the bottom, a list of some of the things that the women did. Just some of the things. So electrical installation, not spelled correctly, angle shearing, spark plug installation, labor distribution assessments, aluminum welding, pretty much everything. So they were really busy working there. And this was actually a famous picture that's in the National African American History Museum on the Mall in Washington, and of this Rosie the Riveter, who was at Vultee. So if you go to the mall in Washington and see this picture, you know that woman is in Nashville. Now the woman I told you before, take a look at this woman that was sitting next to my dad, with the layout. Her name was apparently Sarah Wilder, and she was, as her granddaughter said, a role model. She really was a woman ahead of her time. She, first of all, lived to 108. So I read some of this information off of her obituary, which was just a couple of years ago. So she was an amazing person in so many ways, but she was trained as an engineer. I mean, there were not many women trained as engineers. Even today, the number of women who are engineers lags behind other professions. So it was amazing that she was trained as an engineer. She had a college education. When she started working in factories, apparently they didn't have equipment to train the women. So she went out and to a Sears and bought sewing machines and took them apart and got the parts she needed for the factory work and trained the women on those parts that she was able to get from the sewing machines. And according to her obituary, I think her father didn't know that she worked at Vultee, and he was touring the plant one day for whatever reason, and she had her helmet on, and she went down and she said, "Hi, Dad, how are you?" Sort of shocked him because he didn't know she was there. But anyway, she had a master's in industrial arts from Peabody, which is pretty amazing for that time. So I wanted to honor her, and she worked clearly, she worked right with my dad. I never knew her, didn't really know her name until recently, so. And then there was another story. There was a Dr. Zerfoss in Nashville, and he was a longtime physician here. And the reason I bring him up is because being Jewish in Nashville at that time, there was still a lot of anti-Semitism. And, my mother had those friends she made at Vultee, and her best friend there one day, when my mother had to take off early to go to see the doctor, she asked which doctor my mother was going to see, and my mother said, "I'm going to see Dr. Zerfoss." And her best friend at Vultee said, "Oh, you mean that old Jew doctor?" And that really hurt my mother. It hurt her feelings because this was her friend. But when she came back to work, she confronted her friend and she said, "You know what? I went to see Dr. Zerfoss, and first of all, he's not Jewish. And secondly, I am." She didn't know that. Her friend didn't know that. So, but he was a longtime member of Weston Methodist Church, so clearly not Jewish. They had social life during that time. These are some pictures from that era, the supper clubs they would all go to. That's some of the sports teams I told you about that my dad was on. This was at Vultee. So this is the Vultee basketball team. They call it the Vulcan Basketeers. And then they had a bowling team that's also from Vultee during the war. Finally, the war is won. This is a picture of my family walking to the VJ parade downtown in Nashville in 1945. That's my mother right here, and my grandmother, and other relatives. That's my first cousin. Other relatives there. Finally, we're into the post-war era, and of course, Vultee had to transition to a civilian economy now. The last contract, as I said, was closed out, wartime contract. So Avco started building buses. And this picture, my dad is in this picture. I think this is him right here, overseeing the production of these buses that were being produced at Avco after the war. And of course, the baby boom started. That's my brother there, my mom and my brother, 1940. He was like one of the first baby boomers, February 1946. So since then, a lot has happened, but basically, even though Vultee, the plant has changed names, has changed companies, it's made different things, including parts for the B-36, the Lockheed C-130, parts of the B-1 bomber, as someone mentioned to me before, and other aspects of that over many years through various contractors. It's remained in the production of aerostructures. So either planes or parts of planes or components of aircraft. So we've had aircraft production going on continuously in Nashville since this plant opened in 1940-ish. And so that's something to keep in mind, that we are an aerostructure town, even though people don't think of Nashville producing airplanes. But we do. And we still have NWI Aerostructures, which is engaged apparently in the redevelopment of the plant right now. And as I understand it from Bob, they have demolished the plant.
Not yet.
But they're in the process of demolishing the plant this week or soon.
I haven't gotten a date on it, but it should be any day.
Right. But it seems like they're going to keep production here. They're just building a new facility to do that. Is that the possibly?
I don't know, but I suspect that's
Where is the plant?
It's right next to Berry Field, next to the Nashville airport. Do you know where the
Parkway.
Briley Parkway?
It's on the right. If you go up Raleigh Parkway from 24,
Okay.
it's that big, massive complex.
And it's not far from International Plaza, right? The gold windowed building. If you ever see that when you're taking off in a plane, there's like a high rise, it's gold windows around it. It's right next to that. So after the war, as I said, my father had this specialization in industrial engineering. He had all this experience. He had experience with ergonomics. And he and his business partner, Max Greenberg, bought a plant in North Nashville, which now we call Germantown. And they started by recycling tires into commercial and industrial matting. The company is called Tennessee Mat Company. This was an article in the Tennessean from that era about their starting that business. It expanded product lines over many years. At one point, it had almost 400 employees. And it was right over here in Wedgwood, Houston. There were 8 different buildings, but if you know St. L, the event space on 3rd Avenue South, or Il Forno, the Italian restaurant on 3rd Avenue South, you do? Yeah, all of those were part of Tennessee Mat Company. So they're still in use. There's a record pressing plant. And then on 4th Avenue, there's a new project going in where they've torn down a factory, which was the larger part of Tennessee Mat Company, and are making that into apartments and mixed use. But anyway, so that's what they've done for many years. This was Max standing in inner tubes, a pile of inner tubes. But I would work there as a child and always remember all the tires everywhere, coming in. But they were recycling, really. It was an early recycling business for tires, making them into mats is how they got started. And the company is still going to get today. This is in Smyrna, and that's Warewell's headquarters and factory in Smyrna. This is what the tire mats would have looked like. They don't make them at Warewell anymore, but that's how they were made. That's the inner part of the tire, the fluff part of the tire that they turn upside down, and that becomes the part you step on. And there's some other products that they made or would have made. This one was called Tyrex Tile. But, I mean, you see them all over the world, and my parents went to Washington, D.C. once, and they're standing in line with, it just so happened, their neighbors from Nashville, and my dad stopped the whole line because his mats were in front of the White House. That's a Tennessee Mat Company mat! Hey, that's a Tennessee Mat Company mat! So that's the story, and here we are today, still with the legacy of Vultee in production. So that's kind of the full circle. So I'm happy to take your questions or comments. Yes, sir.
There used to be, I can remember when I was very, very young, there was a Moskowitz department store in Donaldson. Was that your mother's family?
No. There were several different Moskowitz families. Both of my grandfathers were shoemakers. They had little shoe shops. They lived above their stores on Cedar Street, Charlotte Avenue.
Was this a union company?
No. No, it never got to that. Yes.
Did Joe Kennedy, who was flying for Britain, did he fly one of those planes?
That's a good question. I don't know. Good question. Yes.
Were the houses that were built up in Vultee, in that area, were they built at the same time the plant was? They're roughly the same age. I didn't know if they came after the war or not.
They're definitely post-war housing. From what I can tell, I might be wrong, but maybe some of you know better than I do. A lot of them were built right after the war is my impression, but I could be wrong on that.
I didn't know with so many workers if they built that part up there along Vultee Boulevard and Saturn and all that.
Could have. I never heard that, but it could be. They look like they were built in the 40s. Yeah. Yes, ma'am.
My dad worked at Vultee.
Oh, good.
We lived in government housing on Bransford Avenue.
Bransford
Those
Avenue.
Brick duplexes.
Sure.
Which have now been torn down, and now there are little houses of every color all through there.
Ah.
Every different color. Yeah, he was head of the parts department. He was not on the assembly line.
Oh.
But he was an accountant. So they
Ah.
put him in the parts department.
Okay. Well, I'm sure my dad knew him.
Probably.
Yeah.
Edward Baker.
What was his name?
Edward Baker.
Edward Baker. Okay. I'd ask him if he were still around, but unfortunately he's not. But nice to meet you. Yes, sir.
Do you know where the plant in Germantown is located?
It was either Buchanan Street. It was on Buchanan Street, I think. And it was a President Street, but I think it was Buchanan.
Kind of like that.
Yeah, but that was before my time. Anyone else have a?
You were talking
Oh.
about the different things that were built at AMCO over the years. For a while during the 1970s, a few of us got to go on a tour of it, and they were building subway cars. For filling
Oh,
out,
really?
Subway or commuter cars for their
Oh,
commuter
yeah.
agency SEPTA. So they were doing that for a while.
Yeah,
Have any-
I vaguely remember that.
Yeah, I've got pictures of
Yes, sir.
My dad retired from there, and he helped build the C-1A, one of his big wings.
Oh, real? Wow.
And, that was the first time, I think they had, counter set, or what they call boots.
Oh, wow.
This big book, it sits down, and figured out all the angles to how to put rivets on that thing.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, now they have computers that do all of this stuff, but back then you had to use your brain to do manufacturing. Yes, ma'am.
I grew up on Long Island in fifties, sixties. I would hear Grumman and Republic were there.
Mhm.
And that was Cold Wars, and they were making airplanes.
Oh, yeah.
I'm sure military as well.
Mhm. Yeah, and even I think in the 30s or 40s, there were plants on the East Coast. It was just between, they said this was the first plant between the Appalachian Mountains and sort of the West Coast, I think. Yes, sir.
I've got a picture here. This is a 65-foot-long gondola car from the Cincinnati Railway. They're transporting some of the wings from here to Marietta, Georgia. What was in Marietta?
Oh, yeah, Lockheed would
You
have.
may keep that.
Thank you. But this must have been, when would this have been?
I-
50s, 60s?
That was probably post-war, but they were using those 65-foot long. And the ends of the gondola cars dropped down so those wings could fit in there. And they were taken from the Vultee here and taken to Marietta, Georgia.
Ah, okay. Thank you. Oh, what's on the back here? Is that,
That's, later those cars became, when L&N took over the Cincinnati, all those cars were repainted. That's
Oh, okay.
the Same class cars. They had about 5 or 6 of them.
okay, thank you. I think you had something?
Yeah, I was just gonna mention that P-38 Lightning,
Mhm.
getting very, very famous in
Yeah.
the Pacific Theater.
Yeah.
That's really something to be proud of.
Yeah, and the P-38s were mainly made in California, but I think they had a contract for whatever, 130 of them here also. But yeah, they were big. They were very famous.
Named The Arsenal of Democracy,
Mm-hmm.
and it's the story of, was it Knudsen,
Yes.
who mobilized the United States
Yep.
industrial capacity.
Yes, and that was for this gentleman here. Oops, that gentleman there. Yes, General Knudsen. Yes, sir.
And do I take it that, I mean, one of the reasons that the plant was located where it was, is that when the airplanes were assembled, they could then somehow be quickly transferred to a runway,
Right.
airfield, or one of the side ones and flown to wherever they were.
That's right.
headed to. So you had not only the production, but you had also a assembly line of pilots that would be flying them, whether contractor or military, they'd be flying them wherever they
I,
were going.
I presume so, yeah. I mean, they were right next to Berry Field, so it was an operating commercial airport by that time. So they had access to the runways.
Yeah, women pilots also.
Right.
And I'm not sure, but I suspect the National Tennessee Guard would have been there by then also.
Well, and as Tom said, I knew that they had the women air corps, the WAC pilots.
Right.
Who were sort of the reserve, but as they said, I read a story a long time ago, they were incredibly useful in training
Mhm.
for the men pilots, because the women pilots were safer.
Ah,
And more reliable. But, the
still
men
sort of the
would
same way now, isn't
Well,
it?
because, during the war, it's like, we have enough labor, we don't want to lose these planes.
Right.
And so that way the women could do a lot of the more monotonous
training runs, but
Sure.
then to do stuff like each of these planes is important. So
Yeah.
it was fun.
That is great.
Cornelia
Sure,
Yeah,
Cornelia
exactly.
Fort. Someone else had a, yes, yes,
When
ma'am.
Vultee shifted after Pearl Harbor, what branch of the military were the planes for?
So there were not branches, correct me if I'm wrong, but wasn't it sort of the war, it became the War Department? There were not branches yet, that came later, correct?
Well, that.
Like, there was no Defense Department, it was the War
would be
Department.
over Army and Navy Department over the Navy.
There was a Navy Department, there was an Army, I think it was Army,
It was called the Army Air Corps.
Army Air Corps. Okay. Yeah. But there was no Department of Defense yet. It was sort of, but the images that I have that my dad had, I think they say War Department on them. Army. Yes, sir.
What air activity is there out there at the plants now?
You mean air manufacturing
Airplanes now?
Yeah, I mean, this company that's out there now, I mean, you just saw some, or did you see any of the manufacturing, or just the empty building?
They're still making things.
Yeah, they were making wings for a long time.
Components mostly.
Components, and they were making wings. When it was Triumph, I know they were making wings. Where's that?
They made the tails for the C-130A through the H models.
Yeah. I didn't want to go through all the detail of this, but as you can see, there's so many different companies that made different products there. McDonnell Douglas, well, they made parts for Grumman, McDonnell Douglas, Bell and Cobra. Those are the helicopters. They made wings for Grumman and Lockheed, corporate jets, so they did private jets as well, parts for private commercial planes, or private planes. Yes, sir.
We converted B-29s to B-50s out there too, changed the engines and stuff.
Yeah. There was a lot, over the many years after Vultee, they did a lot of stuff. Yes, sir.
And do I take that they may be rebooting or rebuilding the plant? I would assume that they're reconfiguring it for robotics and more efficient assembly. I've gathered with the greater effort to restore different specialized manufacturing, that a key part of that is you're reducing the human factor.
Right.
Even though humans are still going to be involved, but you're having to redo it and do more robotics from mechanical just for the cost efficiency.
I'm sure that's at least a part of it. I also suspect that they don't need a 2.1 million square foot plant anymore, and that they probably are overheating and over-utilitizing, the space, and so they probably want to save money by shrinking it down a bit. I mean, I might be wrong, but I don't know if they're going to build another 2 million square foot plant there. I don't know.
It's also an 85-year-old building.
It's also an 85-year-old building, so it's got, I'm sure, all kinds of structural and utility issues. Did you want to come up and show us some pictures of what's happening now there? Okay.
So last summer, I recently retired and I'm trying to figure out what to do. And I like history a lot. I was on the commission and involved in some other projects. But I have been preaching for a while that if you're going to lose a building, let me image it. So we got something left. I do 360 and 3D. I've got LiDAR cameras. I can go in and recreate a building down to the millimeter with the system I've got. So the Metro Planning Commission was given access to this facility, and they invited me to go along to image it, and it was last summer. And they wouldn't say much, but we got to tour the original facility site. And is there an HDMI? Is Terry, he's not here anymore. Well, if I can't find the HDMI, this won't work. So anyway, I got in there, and we had to wear respirators. There was mold everywhere, and mostly the office building was the worst. So I got 20 images that are
of the office building site and the plant. It was built out in phases, and Randy's, that black and white you saw earlier was the initial phase. It was started in January 1940, and looked like it was pretty much finished by the end of that year, but for some reason it was dedicated in 41. I'm not sure what the lapse was in that, but let's see, this might work after all. And what was really cool is we spent probably an hour there, and the security guard said, let me show you something that, well, I'm still trying to get it working here. So the security guard took us to this room that they had just unlocked, and it was the blueprint room. And it had thousands of blueprints that probably included the P-38. It had the C-130A model, which was 1953. There were so many blueprints in there, I'm sure it had probably just about everything they built. So I called up Ken Feith, who was director of the Nashville Archives. I said, Ken, can we take this from them if they want to get rid of it? And he said, absolutely. So I told him, I said, I'll get a team down here tomorrow and pull all these out, and that offer's still on the table. I've asked a couple of times. Hopefully they recognize the value of this collection and have, removed those. Hey, Tracy, could you help me with this? I don't know if you've ever worked with a Mac before, but so I got the built-in display or the projector, and I've got the HDMI hooked in right there. That's the cable, HDMI. Okay. Well, we might have to save this for another time, but it's weird because it's doing my home screen.
Yeah. I'm gonna try ours just to.
So he said last summer, he said, don't release these until next spring. And so a couple of days ago, I said, hey, we're going to do this meeting. I'm going to show it unless you got a problem. He said, no problem, just, so this is hopefully going to work. I'll put this up on a server, and we can do a link to maybe the Facebook page to where you can guys can go on and look at it later, but
Mirror displays.
extended mirror.
There you go.
Okay, here we go. Thanks for your patience. This is always different. Okay, here we go. So this is the front entrance. Like Randy said, NWI is the company. This is the old office building. It was just, mold. We really had to get in and out of there quick. And this was 1940, and it had the executive offices, the boardrooms, and then we'll go into the plant. He did say, I think this is all that's going down. I don't think the rest of that massive campus, but this is the oldest part. And they were still doing some manufacturing, and so they said, don't, take any pictures of them while they're working. But this is kind of, just to give you an idea of what it looks like. And this is the value of this technology, is that, like Cole Meir, I've been trying to do the same thing. I was like, well, let me go in there and shoot it. It's going away. They're trying to, National Preservation Trust is doing everything it can. But it's in the middle of where 20 is supposed to go to be able to fly to Tokyo. And there's not a chance unless they move it. So go in there, shoot this stuff, so we got something, to visualize in virtual reality what was there. So that's just kind of a look around. I saw their parking lot looked like it had some staging for construction on the other side, so I suspect this is going to happen any day now. These are really big images, so they take a while to load. The first plane I saw pictures of was the Stinson. It looked like a rival for the Piper because it was a two-seater, looked like a trainer, Voyager, the Stinson Voyager. Then there was a beautiful blue plane in that movie. There's a color. What was the name of the YouTube for that? If you type in
San Diego, it was titled something about San Diego.
Yeah, if you type in San Diego, Vultee, that it should come up, but it's color 8mm of flying over the new plant in 1940 and then the Downey plant in California. Originally, they said it was California. I said, nope, this is Nashville, 105th Observation Squadron, which precedes all of this. That's my thing. I was 105th NAF. But I've got, I think I mentioned in the round the world flight speech I did a couple of weeks ago that I've got 1,160 aerial images from 1930 to 1940. Anything you want to see in Nashville, especially downtown, any building is in that collection. They were 9 by 8-inch negatives. The file sizes, they're so big that Metro can't put it on their digital archive site. So I took all of them. They're on a hard drive. There's a spreadsheet I did to identify what I knew was in that grid, and then I used the latitude and longitude for the center of each approximately. But I mean, it's got Stone Mountain. They're carving Robert E. Lee. It's like 1928, 29. They were formed right after World War I, but they started at Blackwood Field. That's a whole nother presentation, the 105th and that whole history. But the airport, and I think I preached this before, if you go to the B&A terminal, there is nothing but guitars. And we have Jack Harding, who was the first flyer around the world in 1924 that nobody knows about. Cornelia Fort, the first female aviator killed on active duty, and was also in the air at Pearl Harbor, and was probably the first American shot at in the air in World War II. Bob Hoover, Mustang fighter pilot, World War II, the best air show performer I've ever witnessed. Frank Andrews, Lieutenant General Frank Andrews. Heard of Andrews Air Force Base? He's from Nashville. MBA, West Point, was going to be the top brass when he was killed in World War II. At the very least, we need placards for all 4 of those, and more. Walter Williams, you keep going with it. But Cornelia Fort deserves a statue. We're forming a committee. I'm meeting with Alan LaQuire and some people in June to find some funding for this. I'd like to see her front and center. You walk in B&A. I mean, this story is long overdue. So anyway, that's my speech.
First of all, thank you so much, Randy, for that wonderful, personalized story of your parents and their pneumatic tube relationship at Vultee Aircraft. And I know from having written about your father that he contributed so much to the aircraft industry here in this town. And Bob has a very special message for us. You'll hear more about it in the fall when we meet again. We do have a couple of more meetings this month, but then we break for the summer and resume in the fall. And I'll send out the program for the fall semester next week, next Sunday. And I think there's some very good speakers on there like we've had today. And hopefully in the fall we can be more supportive of Cornelia Fort at least being heralded at the B&A airport. How many of you were here a couple of years ago when the author of a book about her talked to us? Yeah, several people. Several of you have been around 4 years, so that's wonderful. So anyway, again, thank you, Randy. Thank you, Bob. And next week we have Dr. Cusick, who is at Belmont, and he's a musician. And I'll tell you, he knows his music and this city. So then at the end, we have one of the things that Tennessee on television and talk radio and so forth has become famous for, and that's scandal in the legislature. And we've had a lot of it. And we have both authors of the book about scandal in the Tennessee legislature for our closing talk. And then at the very end of the month, we will have a gathering, and hopefully we can all just sit down and talk about some of the things we've learned and shared this year. Thank you all.